The Economic Snapshot for May Day, the 1st of May 2020. We start with active coronavirus cases. On one degree, it's a little bit more of the same from last week. If we break down some of those numbers, we are seeing a slowing. The UK, the US, and globally, while active coronavirus cases are all up again this week, they are up by a smaller number than previous weeks, and that is something to be grateful for. A reminder that we're looking at active coronavirus cases. You possibly saw the headlines out of the US this week that total cases, including those who have recovered in the USA, have now exceeded 1 million people. Indeed, this week was also the week when more Americans in total had died of COVID-19 than actually died in the Vietnam War, which is a tragic milestone. And while I continue to focus on your business in my area of expertise, we must never lose sight of the health crisis that's going on for many countries. I'm quite fortunate to be based here in Australia at the moment, where for the fourth week in a row, active cases have declined. And in fact, we now have less than 1,000 active cases around our whole country of 25 million. That's going to create some interesting differences in some of the economic figures moving forward. I wanted to jump into that actually and ask a question. Is Australia going to be the lucky country once again? It's a moniker, if you're not familiar with it, that Australia has held for more than a century, where our exposure to resources, everything from wool to iron ore to uranium, has meant that we seem to, as a country, be well positioned to ride out some of the worst of the economic ups and downs. And to give you an idea, if you're not aware, Australia is the only developed country that has not had a recession in the last 25 years. Even through the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, there are only two countries in the OECD that didn't have a recession, Australia and Poland. Poland, unfortunately, since then has had a recession, which means Australia is on the longest no recession streak, which is not quite the same as growth. It's not the be all and end all, but it is something that Australian governments certainly hold themselves to. And to give you an idea of how lucky we were through what we call the GFC, the global financial crisis, much of the rest of the world calls the Great Recession, we have a look at annualized rolling GDP growth across some comparable countries. So we look at the UK, the US, and Canada, their GDP growth numbers from 2006 to 2012. And you can see the UK, deep drop recession, the US, Canada, and Australia managing to ride that wave, partly off the back of resources, although Canada also benefited from that, partly off a stricter financial system and a little bit of luck, which does at the time, and certainly looking back, affirm the lucky country nickname that we've inherited. And if we look at a similar chart for active coronavirus cases, this is from February 15th, so the middle of February to April 30, the last 2.5 months. It's important to note that this is not to scale. This will just give you an idea of peaks and trends. And again, the UK, the USA, and Canada, not to scale. We know the US has the highest number of cases out of those. They're all following very, very similar trajectories. And Australia peaked earlier and has seen quite a downward trend. So in terms of the economic consequences, in terms of what that means for small and medium-sized businesses here in Australia, lockdown restrictions are starting to be relaxed in many states. In one state in particular, South Australia, they have not had a new COVID-19 case in over a week. This could very well mean that we will be the lucky country economically. And while I would still basically bet my house and what I'm doing right now, which is betting my business on Australia having a recession in 2020, there's no doubt that given the impact of the coronavirus, the pandemic, on the economy, Australia is well placed at this point to ride it out. I will give some caution to those Australians who think that maybe this means we're headed for a V-shaped recession, that maybe we're going to recover much, much earlier. But Australia, of course, was recovering from the bushfire crisis when the pandemic struck, and that there were, heading into 2020, some structural concerns within the Australian economy that suggested a recession was imminent regardless of this pandemic. So even though those figures are great from a health crisis, and that probably means good things for us economically, it certainly doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. Looking at the rest of the economic snapshot, those three markets that we're using as indicators, the FTSE, the Dow Jones Industrial, and the ASX 200, were all up this week between 3 and 6%. Remember that markets are a forward indicator. If they're up, that means there's some kind of consensus that things will get better sooner, they will get better faster moving forward, and not necessarily looking at some of the data that is retrospective. Why do they think that things are possibly looking up? Who knows? I report, you decide. No new unemployment figures this week, but the big, which is there in red, was that the US GDP growth numbers for the March quarter were released. The consensus among economists, those in the dismal science, was that the US economy would contract by 4% in the quarter. Actual figures were a larger than expected contraction, negative GDP growth, that wonderful oxymoronic phrase that I love, negative 4.8%. And in doing so, the US has actually ended the longest period of expansion in the country's history, dating back to early in the Obama administration, the dying days of the Great Recession, the global financial crisis. Quarter after quarter of GDP growth has finally, in a cyclical sense, as expected, come to an end. That is also the steepest contraction since the last quarter of 2008, since the depth of the global financial crisis. The Australian figures, I believe, will be out for our next presentation, which means we're going to get an idea of the March quarter. So not some of those April figures when the coronavirus cases were declining in Australia. We'll get the March quarter, which includes the early stages of this pandemic, and also in Australia, the bushfires. So it will be very, very interesting to see how we compare with the US.